That means that we're at the second half of the last of our cycles. Each of these cycles is a 12-week segment, but the 12-week segment is curved. It's arced around so that it is actually a quarter round. And if you put 4 of these quarter round segments together, you would get a circle. And in order not to close the circle, because a closed circle is a rut, we would like to keep this circle of education open. And using a time-honored ancient technique, we articulate in between each of the 4 arcs, the 4 quarter rounds, a space which we call an interval, using the musical notation of the word interval, which means that the interval counts as a part of the composition. In a musical composition, the notes are equaled in importance by the interval pacing. If you do not play the notes with the right interval, you do not have music. If you run notes together without interval articulation, you get sound which approximates noise, but in no way can be shaped for music. Thus, music is always a symbolic sound. And to appreciate music, one must raise experience to symbolic gestalts. So this education is no more difficult, but as sophisticated as moving from a noise to a music. And it takes a while in order to let this develop. In 30 years of educational experience, I have found that the most time-honored of all cycles for learning is that of the week. The week dates itself back to very, very ancient times. And in our particular civilization, our Judaic-Christian underpinning of our valuation and our experience modes, the Sabbath, the idea of the Sabbath, the 7 days, or the 7-day cycle grouped together in 4s to make a lunar cycle. The 28 days of the lunar cycle are the most ancient of all timekeeping cycles. And even the physiology of human females follows this cycle, not because of some cultural decision, and not at all as a sociological phenomenon, but biological. Biological in the sense that the primates preceding our species also had in the women, in the feminine, this particular cycle. So it's older than the species. And so we say it's biological. And it's because of this that this education works so well. But there is a saturation point that you have to reach before the education begins to really work. And the saturation point really is the extent of the course. It's a 2-year course, not because I cannot ideationally compress this and offer it as some super weekend. That's no problem whatsoever. But the exigencies, the reality of our biological cyclic nature, and the necessities of articulation and intervals in composition preclude me from jumping the gun and offering it as some super weekend. And so I have brought it to a 2-year cycle, which is as much as I can compress it without destroying the fabric of values which I seek to convey as the education. Now, the 2 years are 2 cycles that approximate circles, so that you have double circles. And if you put two circles together, you would get an infinity sign. The two circles would be tangent only at one point of meeting. There would be only one point on each of the circles that would be synonymous. That one point is a singularity. And that singularity belongs in our spiritual being. And that we are, both existentially and in reality, spirits that found themselves centrally on a singularity, means that we exist in a universe which allows for other singularities to occur, no matter how peculiar they may seem to us. And the most famous of all those other singularities is a black hole. A black hole in the universe is a consonant with our spiritual awakening as a singularity. I have to modify that phrase because singularity does not allow for us to use a numerical designating article like a. You can't say a singularity. You can say a singleness, a single point. But singularity transcends the point. And so, using a pun here, the point is that there is no point in singularity. And so we need to have a word for a point which vanishes in upon itself. And fortunately, some of the more scientific wisdom traditions of men and women like ourselves in ancient times, who experienced the need for a word for this phenomenon. There are several words available. The most useful one is from India. And in very high Indic yoga, coming about the time that the Gupta dynasty came into India, there were meditators who were extremely sophisticated, and the most sophisticated of all of those meditators was a man named Dharmakirti. And Dharmakirti is famous for his pristine lucidity, both of thought and of expression. And he used a term which he found after using Patanjali's yoga. Patanjali, who was a great meditator, developed a yoga whereby our attention concentrates itself until it vanishes in upon itself and vanishes. But in order to give us a guideline towards that, Patanjali gave us short sentences called aphorisms, and one can buy in many translations now the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali. But those yoga aphorisms of Patanjali stop at a very sophisticated, condensed, we have to call that a horizon, and only then indicate that there's something else that occurs, but nothing can be said upon it. A kind of a Wittgensteinian silence. Whatever occurs after that concentration, when you go further into yoga, beyond that, nothing can be said about it. So that the language occurs only up to that point. Well, Dharmakirti, recognizing the need for wisdom teaching, gave a word to that vanishing point. The word was bindu. And so very often, in late 20th century, sophisticated wisdom traditions one could refer to the interior meditative singularity consonant with a black hole as bindu. Now, what happens when we entertain this kind of language is that we entertain consciously a paradox. We're naming something that is beyond existence. And because it's not a thing, we have to right away put quotation marks around all words that carry the connotation of something. And so we have to say, quote, something beyond a point. What is beyond a point? It's vanishing. It's vanishing. Now one can ask very sensible, practical, everyday question. Is this true? And the answer is unequivocally yes. It's true. And the corollary, the follow-up question is, well, what good is it? Is it going to help me get in line faster at Ralph's? Am I going to drive the I-5? Choose a lane better? The answer is unequivocally yes. But the application of this takes a while to gear down to that level. But every single activity and every single thing in existence is affected by this beyondness. And it's as simple as this. For every form that you use, the line at Ralph's, the fact that Ralph's exists, the fact that there are things at Ralph's that you want, foodstuffs, for everything, for every form to be what it is, it must occur against a background which is different. And so for existence to be, it has to occur within a context of the non-existent. For a point to occur, it must occur within a vacuum. For if the vacuum has any pointness whatsoever, the point will not occur existentially clear as a form. So that artistically one speaks of form and background, and that the difference between form and background is not a polarity canceling each other out, but it's a cooperative nature. And the word for this, coined by Niels Bohr, is complementarity. So that form and background, point and vacuum, are complementarities. And complementarities have existence mutually. So that point and vacuum are mutually existent. They never occur without each other. And that this mutual existence of a complementarity means that all the way through the root of whatever is existent, there is a deeper sense of the mystery of their reality, that they belong together. Their mutualness is what is real, but their distinctness is what is extant. So existence is different from reality. How is existence different from reality? Reality is always the background, and existence is always the form. And existence and reality, form and background, also are complementarity, also are mutual. And any mutuality has a reconciliation, it has a resolution. They do come together. But very frequently, when two things come together, you get a third thing, which is quite different from both. When a thing and a non-thing come together, what occurs cannot be said to actually occur completely. It both occurs and doesn't occur. And so, using paradoxical language with quotation marks, one has to say that paradox characterizes all deep or high resolutions of complementarities. And in order to have some way of talking about this, some way to express this so that we can deal with it or think about it or feel about it, the language that is used now, and probably for the next couple of hundred years, the language that is used about the meeting of the is and the isn't, the meeting of complementarities in their mutually interpenetrating conciliation, that meeting boundary is a membrane, not a wall, but a membrane. A wall is a divider, a polarity divider in existence. And existence permits walls. But the meeting of existence and reality on any level, on any scale, does not permit walls to exist completely. They only partially exist. The walls are penetrable completely on some deep or some high level always, and so the wall is characterized by the term, quote, membrane. And once our ability to appreciate this fineness, it's not so terribly fine, but it's fine enough. Once we can appreciate that the really deep boundaries of movement in the universe are membranes, then we can understand things like black holes, like cells. Do you think a cell can exist with a wall between it and other cells? No. There have to be all kinds of, how does the food energy get from one cell to another? Because the cell is defined by a membrane. And we will see in the next section, coming up in just 2 weeks, when we look at the molecular biology of the cell. And you don't have to read the whole thing, of course. You can if you want to. But I will bring out certain materials and certain examples from the cell to show you that the membrane, the boundary of the cell, is paradigmatic about how reality and existence interface. And so the deep human self is not some mysterious thing that's walled off and separate, but is singularity, not a singularity, but simply singularity, having membrane occurrence, allowing reality and existence to interpenetrate exactly there. Quote there. Now, what is curious about this is that from the standpoint of existence, one cannot follow a point into its vanishing. You can follow a point to its collapse to a point, but we cannot resolve further than that. The smallest point that can be resolved existentially is a quark. And one could even distinguish that there are 6 different kinds of quarks, and only 6. But one cannot resolve existence farther than that. Why? Because there is no existence presentationally occurring beyond that. Although presentation itself occurs beyond that, there's nothing recording it. In a very peculiar way, the brain exists, and the mind is beyond the brain. And the only way to know, because one cannot know the mind. You say, well, that's not true. Aren't there all kinds of books? Read them and weep. The mind, qua mind, for the mind, does not register. But what does register is a different energy, which is so different from the brain and yet so intimately linked to it that one has to understand that somehow they go together, and that energy is consciousness. And the existence of the brain and the differential energy of consciousness together are a complementarity that allow us then retrospectively to understand that we passed through something amazing. We passed through singularity within ourselves, and not only live to tell about it, but we have all kinds of capacity to tell about it that we didn't have before. And so one who has done that, even in a small way, one is really humble about mystery, because this is radically real. So this is an education that brings this before us as a range of inquiry. And most so-called educations are really instructions in spotting the cardboard shapes of the shadows of things. And that identifying process is okay if you're a rodent in a maze and you're looking for simple cheese. But life isn't that simple, as you know. You've not only been around the block several times, many of you have been around the planet several times. You know, it's very screwy, to use a Carol Lombard term from the 30s. And only a screwball can be at home in that kind of mess. This education, if it were simply circles, if it were two circles, or just a circle, and indeed, many of the profound gestalts of education are founded upon what is called the circle of learning. There's even a couple of books titled The Circle of Learning. The great books of the world, the University of Chicago specialized in arranging all knowledge around a circle of learning, and that there should be then some education based on that. And there was an education developed by Mortimer Adler on that. The limitations of that approach are profound and disturbing. We have to have an education that allows for us to breathe in the air of mystery in order to really come into our own. Now let's come back. Let's retrench, let's backtrack. Notice that the language that I use can be continuous and develop, or we can just let it go and come back, and we're not losing anything. We can make our way back to wherever we would like to be. We can rejoin the continuity we can let it go and go someplace else. That's freedom. And the ability for you as men and women to enjoy that freedom is one of the basic values of this education. That if you need to grind the continuity of your life really fine, you can do so. And if you get to just the place, the whim, where you want to just let it go, you can do so without fearing that you're going to lose it, that you're going to miss it, and never get back to it. Now, computers build themselves upon true and false, yes and no, positive and negative. And the brain paradigm for a computer that is based upon, no matter how minute and filigreed the truth tree is, the gate is always, does it open or close? Yes or no? Positive or minus? And you can build a fantastic, what do you call a trillion bits now? Trillion bit complex. It's still limited to existence. Cannot deal with reality. The computer horizon of language cannot deal with reality. Now, existence, the difference between existence and reality is that existence deals with things, and the subtext, the hidden part, is always that those things mutually involve non-things. You have to be aware of that. And indeed, on computer level, yes and no is that the yes is quite distinct from the no, which is simply a non-occurrence. The gate stays open instead of closing. Or you can work it the other way. But reality, the mystery of life, the mystery of the reality of ourselves and of the universe, are beyond the ability of that sieve. And we not only fall through that and rise through that, but we play infinitely in that vast range of mystery left after the cookie cutters stamp out what they can. And it isn't a matter of getting it finer and finer, of having three-dimensional memory chips where you have gigabytes in the size of a sugar cube because you use all the faces of molecular crystals to encode, and so it has nothing to do with that at all. That entire ensemble is limited to existence. Does not move beyond, cannot move beyond the limitations of the existence, and so existence is forever caught in a syndrome. And the syndrome was most beautifully expressed in the 1960s by a poet. The most charming, interesting poet of the 1960s was Yevgeny Yevtushenko. And when he was making one of his visits to the United States, the Soviet government had exiled him several times to his home in Siberia. You are bad. You are writing about things we don't like. This is anti-Plekhanov aesthetics. You're talking about human beings and not the state. You son of a bitch. Back to Siberia. And of course, the problem was that Yevtushenko was raised in Siberia, so they were just simply sending him home. It was not a prison. It was home. And every time he went back home, he would thumb his nose by writing fantastic poems. More fantastic poems. You want to exile me here? All right. I'm at home. Here's another poem. The greatest of all of his long poems is called Bratskaya Station, about a hydroelectric plant. And the hydroelectric plant on the Angara River outside of Irkutsk, where he grew up, took decades to build, but when it was finished, it was quite different from the Egyptian pyramids. And Yevtushenko wrote this long poem, which was a monologue between the pyramid and the electric station, the hydroelectric station. The pyramid took all the human sweat and toil of generations and deposited it dead in the stones of the pyramid, and that was it. And it was all for one person, the pharaoh. Whereas, distinct from that, different from that, the hydroelectric station, brotherly station, Bratskaya, when all that human toil and effort came together, it ignited into electric energy that illuminated Siberia, heated it. And Irkutsk, instead of being a prison town without light and cold, was suddenly a modern city where people like Yevtushenko could be at home. Who wants to be in Moscow when you can be in Irkutsk? But at the center of Bratsk station, Yevtushenko, as an individual, as the poet, wants to know what's at the fundamental base of the hydroelectric station. At the fundamental base of the pyramid was the death place of the pharaoh. What is at that place in the hydroelectric station? And so in the poem, he descends into the bowels of the hydroelectric station. He gets down to the bedrock underneath all the concrete of the dam, and the hydroelectric station is down there. And embedded under the rock, beyond the surface of the earth, are the hydroelectric motors, the dynamos. And they're huge, they're enormous. And the plunge of the Angara, which is a hell of a big river, very fast. Can you imagine the ice melt of about, I forget the area. It's probably the size of the western United States that's drained by the Angara, and it all comes together in one plunge outside of Irkutsk. And there, where it plunges, all that rain, moisture, all that water plunges into a single point. And when Yevtushenko in the poem gets down there, he is stunned and numbed by the monstrous reverberation of the dynamos humming, and their hum is in such deep, there's a synchronicity going on, and it's such a deep hum that he hears it as a word in Russian, and the word translates as everywhere. And he hears only that one word, everywhere, 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 everywhere. And he goes back up from it, and he's reeling and he's dazed in the resonances of that single word are carried by him like a torch, like a hermetic wanderer. He carries everywhere, everywhere. And he comes outside and he looks out onto the primal forest, the taiga, and the city of Irkutsk, and they're meeting together at everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And the light and brotherliness come out of that. And this is part of the mystery of life. And when they let him go, after writing Bratsk Station, they finally realized they couldn't cage him. So, all right, you can travel. So he traveled, he went to San Francisco, and he came to San Francisco, and he did a beautiful poetry reading. Richard Wilbur was there and translated Yevtushenko's Russian. Yevtushenko recited it out loud in Russian, pacing around, his eyes flashing, because he was free, right? We can say anything we want. Goddamn bastard. So the poem, the first poem that occurred was the poem of his being strung out between two cities, the city of Niet and the city of Da, the city of no and the city of yes, between San Francisco and Moscow. And you can read it in the translation. I think it's in several of Yevtushenko's collections, the Wilbur translation. Very good translation. And he says, modern man seems to be garroted on this dilemma of having to walk a tightrope between the cities of yes and no. When are we going to be able to get off of this and go where we would like to go? We can get off it when we stop being hypnotized by the deadly serpent of polarity that makes walls and freeze-dries us into existence and doesn't allow for the osmosis of the membrane of the mystery of reality to air us out and give us freedom. Getting to that appreciation is what the art of education is all about. You have to be an artist to educate. This is a symphony in 8 movements. It takes 2 years to perform. Where's the orchestra? The whole heritage of the planet is the orchestra. We choose the best players. But because what we're dealing with strategically and structurally is always at its deepest level of existence, a two, a pairedness, a bifurcation, a is and an isn't, a yes and a no, nyet and a da. There's a cadence to that, right? It's like Groucho Marx. Say the secret word, and not only do you win $100, but you can go through the slingshot, through the pairs, and emerge mysteriously free. Now, when we're taking molecular biology of the cell in 2 weeks, the pair to it is the biography of Richard Feynman, The Beat of a Different Drum. So this will be our last pair, the last pair in the education. Why do we take pairs of books? Because these are the legs upon which we can walk. We started off in nature 2 years ago, and on January 6th, the Bodhi tree, we're going to start again with the same pair. Because by taking pairs of books, we perform a magician's transformation of the book. Why do we do that? Because the book itself was a mysterious transformation 2,000 years ago. There were no books before 2,000 years ago. What do they have? They had rolls. And rolls were like one-way streets. You could only unroll it. You could be cute and you could roll it back up, but it's hard to read backwards unless you're Jewish. Then you read it unrolling it the other way, and then you have, well, you can see it's confusing. The book, the name for it in Latin was codex. Codex. The making of the codex was a revolution in consciousness. The book represents a radical transformation of the scroll to the book. At the very end of a whole time cycle were the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were the last scrolls. That's why they're so consciously radioactive with meaning. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the last scrolls, and the first book, the first codex, is the New Testament. No lie. The first book is the New Testament. That's why it is so charismatically real. The so-called Old Testament is not an Old Testament at all. It's the Torah with phases of development and resonances, the prophets and the wisdom books and so forth. But the New Testament is not a single roll, a scroll, but it's a fantastic plasma integration of many different aspects into one scintillating crystal, the book itself, that had a 4-part structure, the original Testament was 4-part structure, 4 Gospels. 4 truths that were so woven together that they only occurred together. They only occurred together. And they occurred together in pairs. And because the pairedness was understood at that time, very high wisdom, very smart men and women, they knew that there were a pair of pairs. And so the Gospel of Mark goes with the Gospel of Luke because they're a pair, and the Gospel of Matthew goes with the Gospel of John because they're a pair, and those pair of pairs, like a crosshair, were not originally like a cross, but they were originally like an X. And out of that X rises the sign of singularity, which was designated P. And that symbol, the X with the P, was called the Chi-Rho. And that was the first symbol of the Messiah. And nothing to do with crosses. All that is later PR stuff. Excuse me. Pardon me. It has nothing to do with the mystery of reality. It has everything to do with the limitations of people who still were pablum fed on scrolls and didn't see something new. How can you tell that something is really new? Because it always has a pair of criticisms leveled against it. They're always the same. A, it's not new, and B, it's not true. That's how you can tell it's really new. And deals with reality and not simply existence. Because something really new is not seeable at all. It's fresh from the mystery, like a baby, like a nude baby. Absolutely astounding. It's not visible, but one's appreciation can slowly come to maturation. And so this education cannot be seen by somebody on the outside. It can only be seen appreciatively by patiently doing it and letting its form and its background occur together. And when they do, they really do. They really do. Now we're going to take a little break, but before we do, we have to come to limitations of visibility. It has to do with black holes, has to do with meditative interior. And for that, I have a diagram out of this wonderful book, Scientific American book by John Archibald Wheeler, Gravity and Space-Time. And we want to focus on this diagram here. This is a diagram. On the top is a black hole, on the bottom is a sun, a star. Our star is a bowl in this geometry, and the black hole is a kind of an hourglass. The difference between an hourglass and a bowl, the bowl holds existence, the hourglass funnels everything through, including time, and nothing stays. A black hole is not a nothing, but is a super essential beyondness which occurs and has an energy quality all of its own, but one has to go into a differential mode of energy to be able to understand it. And if you remain in an integral mode of energy, which is wedded forever to existence, to things, not only is it not understandable, but one doesn't even know that it's there. Because there's no there. Didn't Gertrude Stein say that about Oakland, California? Right here, there's no there. That's why she stayed in Paris. In Paris, there's a there everywhere. Everywhere. Well, you can see I can integrate as well as you need. But what I'm trying to say is that the first year of the education is all about integration, but the second year is about differentiation. And one has to get on deep physical, physiological, as well as emotional, as well as mental, as well as insightful level, that consciousness is a differential energy and is completely invisible to us on the tribe level. You cannot have beating drums and consciousness together unless it's really in very high mystery. Well, there are very few people who have ever been able to do that. Usually, it's one or the other. And the best that a true education can do is to give you the freedom and the facility that you can appreciate both aspects. You can appreciate the differential infinity of consciousness and a universe that is full of surprises. Or you can get back to the good old woods around a good old fire in the real night and dance and tell stories and be happy about that too. This education doesn't junk anything, but it makes available the freedom for all of that, like a good membrane to be enjoyed. Let's take a break. We come back after the break, and here we have another way of looking at what we're talking about today. What are we talking about today? We're talking about high science today. Really high science. We're talking about 21st century everyday reality. Our lives in the 21st century are increasingly going to be characterized by an awareness and a conscious strategy. A strategy that is real rather than a reaction that is merely existential. The old paradigm was a reactiveness. I don't want to reduce it and truncate it and make it sound like some kind of spiel, some kind of doctrinaire thing. We can even doctor it up and say, well, it was a response. What was it a response to? It was a response to a linear visualization, a line of visualization that in its really developed quality was a two-dimensional picture which could be in a ultimate development put into motion so that the moving picture was the best that that brain could do vis-a-vis comprehending itself, you, others, whatever, the universe. And it was a marked advance over what had come before, and what had come before was an advance over what had come before that. The book is the paradigm of this linear visualization, so that the mind is used like a tool to linearly visualize. In no way is the mind a linear visualizer only. The mind has infinite capacity, indefinite shapes of toolness which it can be. And one of the crunches of this particular education is to be point man or point woman, point person, on announcing that sky is falling like Chicken Little. What is the sky falling on? it's falling on a mentality that no longer is sufficient tool to deal with what's going on. Even on level of moving pictures, not enough. And especially on level of static pictures and on linear visualization, no way. It's not enough. In a way, the linear visualization of the past 2,000 years, that mind is a sluggish carryover of the previous mentality. The previous mentality can be symbolized as people who read scrolls. In order to get their ideas, they had to follow the unraveling of a scroll. And however that unraveling went, the mind then shaped itself vis-a-vis that linear visualization. The codex was a radical transformation of the scroll 2,000 years ago. So that time actually occurs in forms. And one of the forms of time seems to be about a 2,000-year cycle. And within that 2,000-year cycle, there are 4 sub-cycles of about 500 years each. And in antiquity, these were called the cycles of the phoenix. The characterization symbolically is that about every 500 years, this fabulous symbolic mythic bird, the phoenix, would return back to its nest and dissolve into fire, and out of the ashes of itself would rise a new phoenix. And that the home of this fabulous bird was Egypt. And the telling of this information is not in some occult book, but in one of the standard Roman histories by Tacitus, the most staid of all great writers. Somber Tacitus. So that about every 500 years, as it went 2,000 years ago, there's a change of phase, and about every 2,000 years, there's a complete change of cycle. So that there are phases within a cycle. So our education, being cognizant to this, being recognizably alert to these kinds of structures, has 4 phases within a cycle, but presents a double cycle to stop us from being simply circled. Do you remember in Viva Zapata, where the peasants with Marlon Brando and Anthony Quinn are there with their hats in their hands, and the Presidente circles the name of trouble causers? And at the very end, Marlon Brando, who is the Presidente, finds that, what is your name? He circles it, and right there he realizes he's caught in the rut. When he does what a free spirit always should do. You get your hat and leave. I didn't register. It goes off the screen. Pull back a little bit. Let's have some gesture room. I used to lecture standing up. I have to stand sometimes. I used to have to lecture like a gunfighter. I used to have to move. And I had problems here at the Philosophic Research Society. I couldn't lecture seated. And it took a long time for Manly Hall to show me how to speak spontaneously from a seated place. And I was astounded that you can do it. I was absolutely amazed, but the chief was good. He could shoot faster and more accurate from his seat than I could moving around. So it's like the old yoga, right? If they do it better, well, that's it. You do it that way then. Very pragmatic. no ego at all. The linear visualization on a scroll originally came in as the hieroglyphics on the inside of a pyramid. The very first picture writing, it's called picture writing. The very first written language occurred only in, particularly, specifically, as linear visualizations. And in order to give some kind of variance, some kind of interest, some kind of lumpy texture to the linear visualizations, some of the linear images were taken out of the line, the horizon of the language, and were given a special character. Those words were circled with an oblate ellipse. Do you know what an oblate ellipse is? Well, when I say the word, you'll get it. They were cartoushed. Any visual picture that had a cartouche line, an oblate ellipse drawn around it, was different from and read as different from all the rest of the visual images. And what was cartoushed was the name of the guy paying for the pyramid, the pharaoh. And that word was called sacred. And it was a sacred word because it was within an oblate ellipse, a cartouche. So a modified linearity of language is that there's a blip that registers when that line hits a cartographical something. Blip. So here you go on the inside of the pyramid. Remember the hydroelectric station? There are no hieroglyphs on the hieroglyphic hydroelectric station. There are no such thing. Ask Yevtushenko. There's no such thing because it's a different form. The new mind that the book was, people of the book, instead of people of the pyramid. Do you get it? The whole retrospective thing about Moses leading the people out of Egypt is that you cross over from people of the pyramid to the beginnings of people of the book. And the first leaf of the book are the 10 Commandments. The two little Cecil B. DeMille arched stone tablets that Charlton Heston brings down, gets pissed off because they're going back to the old thing and smashes them. Right? Why the 10 Commandments? Why is that the title of the film? Because that's the synthesizing symbol of a new kind of humanity. People of the book live in a community of each other rather than a society which is a pyramid, which is lifelong preparation for the death of one guy. Why should our lives be spent preparing for the death of one guy when our lives could mutually be spent living together? So the community is different from the pyramid. As the French Canadians say, eh? Hey, Jacques! You don't need to be a lumberjack. You can understand that, eh? Ah, I can see by your faces. You understand it. It makes sense. A radical shift has already taken place And in retrospect, it will be that the book transcended itself into a new gestalt. But the only way to bridge that, to get to that new gestalt, which cannot be visualized at all, is not visualizable. No way, because the mind operates in such a way that it obviates visualization completely. So the only way to get there is a bridge, and the bridge here is the technique of using pairs of books. Now the brain, in order for itself to function, is in two phases. The brain physiologically are short-lived cells, neuron and connective tissue and some blood and so forth. But there's a radical difference between the structure of something and the structure infused with life. The mind is the life of the brain. And the life in no way is limited to this structure. Forget reincarnation. That's a very clumsy way to visualize something that is already 2 aeons out of date. Sorry, has nothing to do whatsoever. Part of the reason of the Buddha delivering his sermons was to free people from karma, from not just from karma, but from the need to walk on the crutches of the old understanding. And that was 2,500 years ago. It was already new, out of date. That newspaper is so yellow that and hard, it looks like the road in Oz. The road to the wizard is paved with old, yellowed, bricked newspaper clippings of mentalities that are fossilized, have nothing to do with life. My favorite quotation from Jesus, you are given a choice between life and death, choose life, is very simple. Choose life. The scroll was replaced by the codex, and the codex is being replaced by something not visible. And so the only way to bridge to it is to use books in pairs. So it constantly reminds us that we're not reading texts. Our education is founded on pairs of books and has nothing to do with texts. And even if textuality is distributed in a clever way known as intertextuality, it's still the same, can I use that term? Crap. It's a static limitation, which presupposes a mind, which is a tool which was out of date 2,000 years ago already. Now, we have to keep the history, the phases, the cycles intact in order then for the new to disclose itself appreciatively. Otherwise, not there. You can't have an ice cream scoop on the ice cream cone without the cone. You have to have the cone. Not that you can't hold the ice cream glob, but it's not an ice cream cone then, right? So the so-called past is integrally bound up in approaching a membrane of the present so that the future can occur beyond it. And the use of the past is for us to hold the cone in such a way that we can lick the future and enjoy it. So that the Principles of Neuroscience. There's a third edition that came out just this year at $100 some a volume. I can't afford the new edition yet. Principles of Neuroscience has as its frontispiece the first surgical papyrus, the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which comes from Egypt, from the old pyramids. And on the cover of Principles of Neuroscience is a cartouche. So that being conscious doesn't mean throwing away the past or getting rid of it, but of transforming it, of using it in a new way. Using the past in a new way is the first step in a transformation. When you use the past in its way, it uses you. When you use the past in a new way, you use it. What's the it here? The it in all of this, the one ingredient in all of this, which is the synthesizing media, is language. Language. Language in its written form was initially a linear picture, a linearly pictorial inside the pyramid. And the whole purpose of putting it there in that form was to lead to a death of the only person that counted. Now, this is not particularly Egyptian. In China, the emperors were the same way. When the Chinese civil service was founded in the Han Dynasty, Han Wu-Ti, the emperor at the time, about 140 BC, had 130,000 people working for him, and their whole purpose was to work so that he could be the emperor. And his main thing was, just like the Egyptian pyramids, to prepare for his immortality. Other people were usable, disposable commodity. Whereas the other paradigm came out as the nephew of Han Wu-Ti, Prince Luoyan, who got together a number of men and women and their discussions about a mutual complementarity, a gestalt of total freedom in the Tao, resulted in a book that still has not been translated into English because it's very dangerous. Even though the book is over 2,000 years old and is already out of date, in terms of something new, still no one's translating it. 20 years ago, I asked Master Ni, will you translate? I will help. Let's get this translated. Not much response. Why? Because when a population of people get it, they don't queue up to pay the big prices for little leaves. They know how to go out and get their own little leaves au naturel. And they live in such a way that they don't need little leaves at all. You don't need expensive medicines when you're natural. But however you master integrating yourself into nature, it in no way prepares you for the conscious universe. Because the farthest reach of the waves and resonances of nature lap out at a vanishing point. And yet, reality continues as if nothing had happened because there was no walls for reality. Reality has no walls. Existence, in order to have form, has walls. Even time has walls. Time forms have walls. And a time form cannot go beyond its own defining limitation. When an age is over, that's it. The poetic way of saying is that the stars have lost their powers. Or another poetic way of saying it is that the gods are dead. The old gods are dead. There are many examples in the antiquity of 2,000 years ago. One of the surviving great essays from one of the great writers ahead of the mystery school of his time was Plutarch. And one of his surviving essays is why the old oracles work no longer. They worked for thousands of years, they no longer worked. The Oracle of Delphi didn't work in Plutarch's time. None of the oracles anywhere in the ancient world worked anymore. You understand? The well springs of the mystery of reality no longer flowed through those ways. And you could visit those places, but you could only visit them as a silent traveler. To use Lin Yu Tang's wonderful phrase, silent traveler. Somebody who just visits and passes on, passes through, says nothing. In other words, the holy places were only spots for tourists. The same thing now with the so-called masters, the so-called wise people, the so-called ascended people. They're sites that were really fruitful for a couple thousand years. There's no energy there. There's no mystery at all. There's no Tao. There's no there. Why? Because all of that space of existence is time-bound. And when that time frame reaches its limitation, the life is gone. It meets every specification for an oak branch except one. It's not alive. This education is alive. It has the juices of the mystery that vitiate, is that the English pronunciation? Vitiate the existential forms so that time lives. Living time. That was the ancient Egyptian way of talking about this, living time. In our approach to material, in our approach in science, we talked about how the circle, we began this morning with the circle. We began with the fact that there are four sections of 12 lectures each that could form a line. They could form a visual line. And in fact, the first response out of the time-formed mind that we've had and passed on to us as men and women from children on up, and our parents from children on up, back some 100 and some generations. Our first response is to try to make pictures of what's going on and join those pictures together so they form a line, a linear pictorial. And we can go so far as to make one or two special visuals, cartouche, so that they have symbolic value. But that's as far as it goes. When the Codex first came out, when the New Testament first came out, it was put together in the early 2nd century AD. A man named Marcion in Rome put it together, put the first four together. And certain names, the name of God, which could not be said, the name of the Christos, the name of Jesus, those names were given a kind of an underlying, but the underlying went above the name. And those overlined words were meant to be read as cartouche, because that was the nature of the way in which the new was using the cone of the past, but using it in a new way. And those were the sacred names, the sacred words. They were like symbolic mantras that could be excerpted out of the line of pictoriality and be contemplated in and of themselves. And when they were, instead of there being a line of meaning, a line before and a line afterwards, they were taken out of the line of meaning. And when they were just by themselves, without the adjoining lines, they had to float free. And when they floated free in the mind, they were transformed out of linearity into a suspension. And the only way that people could get that they could be suspended was the rather clumsy, but nevertheless very humane idea that they had to have wings in order to stay suspended. And so sacred words became winged words. And even that was using something that was 1,000 years old at the time. I mean, Homer already was talking about winged words long time ago. But in creatively trying to bring the new in, one has to do the best you can and to accept certain bridging techniques. And there has to be a spiritual protector with wings that helps guide one over these bridges. Even that's an old, archaic symbol. This particular symbol of the guiding angel who helps us over the bridge of peril comes from 2 aeons ago, comes from 4,000 years ago. Comes from Zarathustra. The Chinvat Bridge. And Diana, the feminine protectress of the spirit's reality, she guides us over the Chinvat Bridge, which narrows and narrows and narrows, and it becomes so narrow that the edge becomes like a razor and even narrower, so that the edge becomes so sharp that anything that's on it would split into two. Nothing could maintain its footing on such a sharp bridge. And so Diana, with her winged helpfulness for the spirit, helps us to transcend the ever-narrowing, razor-sharp edge of duality and float free in wholeness. And then we are saved. That's how Zarathustra talked about 4,000 years ago. That was the time of the really powerful gearing up of written language, so that these lines of pictoriality had a spiritual quality to them at the time. And they lasted all that time till the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then the book, the Codex, had to come in and transform that linear line of visuality, that train of thought. Had to be derailed. But not in a destructive way, but in a creative way. And so the book is not just a line. You don't just read it from cover to cover. That's a very old pedestrian idea. That's a misuse of the book. Yes, you can read it from cover to cover. But the best way to read a book is to explore it. That's why at both ends it has an indexing matrix that allows you to hip, hop, and skip and play in the book. It has an index at the back, has a table of contents at the front. At the beginning, it tells you what the overall gestalt of all of this is in a cartouche, so you're the sacred one. You can transcend the linearity right away if you want to. and it has an indexing matrix like an index in the back, keyed to various symbols. And you can run through this so you can play. A book is meant to be played in. That's what it's for. The linearity is of secondary importance. Once upon a time, there's a little aside, the most sophisticated minds in the world were in Ireland. The dogged, red-haired, green-eyed ruffians became the most sophisticated carriers because they were the only ones left who understood the creative play of the great nuances of the Greek language Gestalt. The Byzantines were frozen in what was called the mosaic jeweled style. They could do any kind of patina as long as it was in mosaics and make the glittering icons that were supposed to be jewels. And contemporaneous with these Byzantine frozen mosaic pseudo-jewels was a real Irish jewel like the Book of Kells. That's still there. You don't think Dublin would let it out, do you? No, it's in Trinity College in the library, and they turn one page every day. Why? Because you don't have to have more than any one page of the Book of Kells. Each page is its own sacred word made for meditation to get you suspended into the wingedness. But when you look at the page that presents Jesus, it only has a Chi-Rho on that page, enormously filigreed and ornamented by spirals within spirals and wheels within wheels, just like Ezekiel said, way up there in the air. Nowhere does it say, like the Byzantine doctrinaire things, that all these are specifications. This is the spec sheet on the Messiah, whether it's many-bodied, two-bodied, one-bodied, monophysite, whatever. The Irish ruffians didn't really care because it was irrelevant, because there was the Chi-Rho and the Book of Kells, and once you got that, you were freed forever from having to fiddle with little tiddlywink mosaics to piece and try to patch together some kind of picture of what's going on. Well, what's going on is moving so stealthily, so fast, in such a large way that it passes right through you while you're wondering. And you never even see it. The new is like that. It is so stealthy, so large, so fast, that if you're trying to use the old brain-based mind, it's like sieving the air. You're not going to catch anything but a few bugs. The limitations of the old mentality are useful because they're the cone that helps us to hold the ice cream of the new. So we showed this illustration from gravity and space-time, talking about black holes. The top is a graph of a black hole. The bottom is a graph of a star, our sun, for instance, or a planet. A celestial body is there because its existence is cupped by space-time. Space-time is curved, and wherever the curvature makes a cup, something can be there. But like Lao-Tzu says, the utility of the cup is the cup, the space of the cup, and not what's in it. The utility of what's in it may be water, may be wine, but the utility of the cup, qua cup, is its space. That's its Tao. The cup itself is its Te, but the space made is its Tao. Only a spiritual being can hold that cup and appreciate the emptiness and the utility, the versatility of the empty. Only someone conscious can do that. And so consciousness is very weird. It's very strange. And when you look at something like the December 1995 edition of Scientific American, here's the article, The Puzzle of Conscious Experience. I'm up to date. Yeah. The puzzle of conscious experience. How does a brain become a mind, and however does a mind become conscious? They don't even get to the very beautiful mystery of how does consciousness become spiritually evanescent. Ooh. That's the question Nicodemus asked, right? But where does it go? And instead of being cute and saying, well, where does it come from? He was just told, it passes through. It was used in one of the earliest Old English poems, where life was likened to a hall that was brilliantly lit at night, and everybody's feasting in this hall, and there's a great big, huge, beautiful window with no pane, and a little bird flies in from the night. For a little while, flies around the hallway, and then flies back out into the night. And our life is like that. Our life is like that. This stuff has its season, but we don't. We're for all seasons, for every season. A spirit for every season. Life without end. Is it true? Absolutely true, but only absolutely true. It is not something which can be proved by existence. It's something that is appreciated by reality. So when you're looking for proofs of God based on existence, you're using a mentality that's out of date. This kind of graph, and this is incidentally a one-dimensional graph, not two, not three, but only a one-dimensional. It's a vertical, horizontal line that's rotated, and you get this kind of graph. This kind of pictoriality is different from a linear pictorial presentation, and the subject is called topology. The graphing, the mapping, is called topology. In a way, the codex was a topograph of an experience horizon. The language of a book can now be looked at in terms of topology. And one can see that there's a very interesting thing, because imagination is all based on pictures. Image, imagination. And thus, all geometries are related to imagination. This is the classic book on it by David Hilbert, Geometry and the Imagination. This is the Hilbert of Hilbert spaces in higher mathematics. And when you look at the little book that is sort of an appendix to Hilbert's Geometry and the Imagination, Elementary Concepts of Topology by Paul Alexandrov, published in 1932, along with Hilbert's book, Anschauliche Geometrie. 1932 was the last time, for a long time, that a Russian creative mind could do something like this, because the very next year, the Stalinist terror came in, and they purged everybody like Alexandrov. Because tyrannies do not like freedom, especially when it lives in people. Because a Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior by himself can defeat any kind of tyranny whatsoever. You name it. And in Elements of Topology on page 6, we come to something that is primordial in terms of elementary concepts of topology, we begin with the concept of a simplex. You've heard of complex? Simplex. The concept, the idea of a simplex. A zero-dimensional simplex is a point. A one-dimensional simplex is a straight line segment. A two-dimensional simplex is a triangle. A three-dimensional simplex is a tetrahedron. And wouldn't you know it that the pharaohs got it all wrong. It's not a pyramid after all, it's a tetrahedron. To show you how dumb they were. Mox Nix. They tried to get cute with stuff they didn't even understand on their own reductive level. And we're supposed to worship that? Come on. More next week.